Have you ever wondered which country France has the longest border with? So France borders Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Monaco, Andorra, Spain. So why don't you guess, which country do you think France has the longest border with? Well, if you guess Brazil, then bingo. So this is French Guiana, an overseas department of France. But how did this happen? So to explore this, let's go back to 1499. So this region highlighted was called the Guianas. So there was a Spanish Guyana, a British Guyana, a French Guyana, a Dutch Guyana, and a Portuguese Guyana. But Spanish Guyana became a part of Venezuela, and Portuguese Guyana became the Brazilian state of Amapá. So when people refer to the Guianas today, they're mainly referring to the modern-day countries of Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana. So although Columbus saw the coast of the Guianas in 1498, it was not until a century later when interest actually spiked in the region. So this man here is Sir Walter Raleigh, who began exploring this region in search of El Dorado, which I'm pretty sure many of you have probably heard of. So after the publication of his accounts, although unsuccessful, this region became famous and the Dutch, British, and French joined the Portuguese and Spanish in the region. So in the next couple centuries, many plantations were established, and after some unrest, things settled down in 1814 when the region officially became known as Dutch Guyana, French Guyana, and British Guyana, which I previously mentioned. So let's start with Dutch Guyana. So Dutch Guyana went on to become Suriname, but it was actually the English who first settled in this region before the Dutch. It was a popular region because it was an excellent place for sugar plantations, which led to many disputes between the French, Dutch, and English. Interestingly, in 1667, in the Treaty of Breda, the Dutch kept the plantation in Suriname, which they had gained from the English, and meanwhile the English gained New Amsterdam, which became this city right here. Soon enough, coffee, cocoa, sugarcane, and cotton plantations all appeared in the region. The plantations relied on enslaved African people who were treated terribly, and a small minority of indigenous people in the region. Many of the enslaved Africans were actually able to escape into the forest with the help of the indigenous people, and they became known as the Maroons, essentially their own ethnic group. After slavery was abolished in 1863, Javanese and Indian workers were brought to work on the plantations, and after that, Chinese and Middle Eastern workers were brought for the same purpose. And this is the result in modern-day Suriname, one of the most diverse populations in the world. Now moving on to British Guyana. So British Guyana is now modern-day Guyana, and here the Dutch actually first established colonies, but instead of finding empty land, they found a region inhabited by Arawak and Carib tribes. Initially, the Dutch wanted to establish trade relations with these tribes, but as time went on, they refocused their efforts on land acquisition. The Spanish would also want to have interest in this area and occasionally harass the Dutch colonies, but the Dutch won this one out. Just like in Suriname, plantations were created where enslaved Africans were forced to work in terrible conditions. The working conditions were so brutal that they revolted several times, almost gaining control of the entire colony if other European forces did not interfere. So after this incident, the British were allowed to come to Guyana to establish their own plantations, and for a while this area was passed from the Dutch to the British to the French, all the way up until 1831 when it was ceded to the British and remained that way up until 1966. Lastly, French Guyana. So French Guyana is not its own country, but rather an overseas territory, integral to France, and therefore integral to Europe as well. A little fun fact, the first to try to establish settlements here were actually the Italians, but that expedition failed horribly. France tried next, and they too failed horribly when thousands of settlers died from disease, climate, and famine, and they were also attacked by the Portuguese from the south, the Dutch, and indigenous people of the area who viewed them as invaders. France eventually regrouped and established plantations where the working conditions were equally terrible, but they would also go on to establish prisons where 10% of the people who were sent there would survive due to the harshness of the area. Now fast forward to present day. Suriname gained independence from the Dutch in 1975, but it still remains a close ally of the Netherlands. It is the only country outside of Europe where Dutch is spoken by the majority of people, and they are still one of the most diverse countries in the world to this day. In addition, 30% of Suriname's land is protected by the law and is incredibly biodiverse. Guyana is the only English-speaking nation of South America and is also incredibly diverse. Over 70% of their natural habitats remain pristine. So to put that into perspective, there are currently 8,000 plant species that we know of growing in Guyana, and half of them cannot be found anywhere else in the world. Lastly, French Guiana is part of France and the EU, and they are the largest economy of the Guianas, partially due to the large subsidies that they gain from France. 98.9% of French Guiana is still covered in forest, and even more interestingly, the Guyana Amazonian Park is the largest national park in the EU, which spans across approximately 40% of French Guiana's territory. Every year when scientists come to explore this region, they find a new species in one of these three nations almost always. However, the region is still underdeveloped for this reason. For the Guianas, most of the population is concentrated into three towns on the coast: Georgetown, the capital of Guyana; Paramaribo, the capital of Suriname; and Cayenne, the capital of French Guiana. If you drew like a strip on the top of the coastline, 9 out of 10 citizens would live in that area because the inside is almost uninhabitable due to the amount of forest. Guyana itself means land of many waters. The biggest rivers are big enough to contain full nations, like the nation of Barbados. But even though these rivers are huge, they still pose a big challenge. There are way too many rapids, and shipping is not easy. In fact, the only vessels that can make it across these are canoes where you can drag them across land. Because of this, there has been very limited development for communities on the interior, and they don't really have access to the modern day world. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe.